All right, Alfred Kinsey. And so we talked about one of those other sexologists who did use surveys, but Kinsey used interviews and really started to ask questions and then put it into numbers. So like different behaviors, like within the questions, like within the last week, I engaged in intercourse, and then the options are like 0 times, 1 to 3, 5 to 6, sort of thing, and then mark it. And so he was able to say, each item would correspond to that. And so he saw, which was true in our research of sexuality, that if we're going to be scientific and objective and whatnot, we need to think about behaviors and psychology and try to boil them down into numbers that a person can respond to questions and whatnot. He was another one of the researchers that said, sex outside of the reason for procreation is healthy and normal. He did a lot of prevalence research. So what do people actually do? What's out there? What's the prevalence of homosexual behavior and things like that? And because he was so, most people during that time didn't really want to talk about sexuality so explicitly, and were kind of off-put by this person who wanted to know all the details of people's lives. I didn't know him, so I can't really say for sure, but it seemed like he was a good guy just trying to be scientific about sexuality and whatnot, and so he seemed to be a person who helped us overall as far as that goes. But a lot of people were off-put by him, considering him amoral for even studying these sort of things. He founded an Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, so that's very cool. Let me make sure. Okay. So something else that he contributed that we've talked about before, a lot of myths in our society for a long time, that women didn't even really have a sexuality, no sexual desire, no ability to orgasm, and all these sort of things. And he's like, well, actually, I asked all these women about this sort of thing, and they're having sexual desire, they're having orgasms, and all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of interesting that a lot of these people who feel very hesitant about learning more about sexuality, you have a scientist come along, and he's like, well, let's actually study this and see what people are doing. We'll talk about the Kinsey scale in our lectures on sexual orientation, but he was the first to say, come up with a scale of saying, on a scale, I think it's 0 to 7, where do you fall on your sexual orientation? Are you exclusively heterosexual? And then at the far end, are you exclusively homosexual? Or in the middle, are you equally attracted to same-sex and opposite-sex people? So he was one of the first ones to put people on a scale like that, which was pretty cool. A lot of his research was accused of self-selection bias, so he's trying to generalize to people at large and say, for example, 20% of people, of married couples, have sex once a week or something like that. But in order to say that, he has to have a random sample, which we'll get to what a random sample is. He has to have a random sample of people to be able to conclude things like that. But what his research is rightly accused of is that a lot of people who participate in his research were just generally more open to talking about their sexuality, probably more experienced, more educated, and things like that. So he was really accused of that self-selection bias of participants in his research. Doesn't mean it's all of his research is garbage. We just need to, think about that as we talk about him. There's a film on YouTube. You have to buy it. It's just a few bucks. That's pretty good on Kinsey that I saw some of. So you may want to get that, but check that out if you have time. All right, Masters and Johnson. And so they were kind of similar to Kinsey in that they're like, just basic sexual intercourse. We barely have any scientific data on that. So what's the best way to really understand sexuality and sexual response, like arousal and things like that? And it's like, well, let's actually have people come into the laboratory, engage in masturbation or intercourse, and measure a lot of physiological type responses, so like heart rate and things like that, erections, lubrication, and things like that, physiological markers of arousal. And so this is another book that you could buy on Amazon or find at the library and peruse through a little bit, Human Sexual Response. And this is where they recorded all of those episodes of people having sex with each other and the conclusions that they made from that. And so this was the beginning of research of being able to help with people who were unable to have sex, either from pain like vaginismus and other sort of problems, being able to be like, oh, okay, things like erectile dysfunction exist or premature ejaculation, and trying to kind of see, what sort of people may need a little bit of help from a professional on engaging in sex if they want to. Check this link out. It's a pretty cool art compilation of a lot of the beginning of sexual science that we've talked about today. It's pretty neat. I like that video. So let's talk about some more modern research in human sexuality. We've talked a lot about kind of like the 1900s, 1950s sort of thing. So like what's some more recent studies that are out there. So the National Health and Social Life Surveys is something that's pretty big. Took a random sample of over 3,000 adults and to find out things about their sexuality. So things that might not have been studied before, such as infidelity, you have these anonymous surveys and whatnot, and it's like, well, you want to know the question, like how often do people cheat on their partners and whatnot, and it's like, well, what's the best way to actually assess for that? It's like, well, maybe these private anonymous surveys would work for that. Maybe people would be honest on them, whereas they may not be in an interview because they have a lot to lose. If their spouse found out or partner found out that they were cheating on them, it's safer just to say, no, I haven't cheated on so-and-so, this anonymous survey that'll never get back to their partner, maybe they will actually say. So that can give us the prevalence of infidelity in our society, and so they're one of the first people to study things like the prevalence of homosexuality as well. And we're going to take a closer look at this one, the National Survey of Sexual Behavior. They've been going at it for, I think, at least 20 years or more. The last installment was in 2018. Center for Sexual Health Promotion at Indiana University in Bloomington. It's a picture of that university. And so far, they've collected data on over 20,000 people, which is great, in a very wide range. Kind of general sort of questions. They've concluded that Americans engage in a wide variety of sexual behaviors. It's not just penile-vaginal intercourse or masturbation, but people do a lot of other things. So let's check out this link here. We'll go through some of the conclusions that they had. So like I said, there's an enormous variability in everything that people do. And so they've concluded that about 40 combinations of different sexual activity that people regularly engage in. Conclusions like, actually, many older adults do continue to be sexual throughout their lives. And so it's good to know that. Maybe this helps with things like myths in our society that older adults don't engage in sexuality. And it's like, well, when you actually investigate, it's like they do. Talk about studied orgasm, difference between men and women. So you can give this a look at this, all their major conclusions here. I think they're pretty interesting. National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior. Okay, so like I said at the beginning of this lecture, I'm going to have some thought-provoking questions throughout. So like, if we were in person, then this would be the time and opportunity that I would ask you, the class, these questions, and may get you to talk with your partner who you're sitting next to about it and things like that. But for this semester, we're just all online, so what we'll use our thought-provoking questions as is a time to pause from the video and just think about these things on your own. And so the question I came up with, is it valuable to gather data on people's sexual behavior? If so, how so? If not, what makes you say that? So for so long in our society, we didn't gather data on people's sexual behavior. Is this a good thing to do? Obviously, you kind of know my opinion about that. But what could be some of the benefits of studying people's sexuality scientifically? And maybe we don't want to study some people's sexuality. Who would they be, and why would we not want to study them? Hello everybody again. So what we talked about before, which was a lot of the early historical figures in Western sexology, if you will, 1900s to 1950s in the West, the heavy hitters. You could say a lot of that isn't in your book, but this stuff is. Your chapter 2 is more about what I'm about to present to you right now. So if you had a psychology class before, probably really any social science type class, this is going to be familiar to you, but I'm going to try to, infuse it with what does it have to do with the psychology of sexuality. So this is in your book right here, summary of research methods. Probably over 90% of people who study psychology of sexuality use surveys asking people about their beliefs about psychology and behaviors and things like that. It's just so easy. We'll get into advantages and disadvantages of each method, but for surveys, it's just so easy to ask people anonymously online about their sex lives and emotions surrounding that and all that sort of stuff. But let's talk a little bit about case study first. So case studies is good for all of the psychoanalytic people use case studies, that being people who adhere to like Freudian or Jung, one of Freud's followers, Jung, that sort of thing. They'll do case studies of a particular person and go through all of what they believe their neuroses has been caused by and treatment and things like that. And then you get other random case studies. Most of it's clinical. They want to understand like what this particular person's problem was and then how to resolve it. So like one very odd case study that I've come across in research was a man who liked to have sex with horses. So you're not really going to find that as far as like we surveyed the 20,000 or 30,000 people who all like to have sex with horses. It's like, no, that's a very, very uncommon behavior, pretty much. So it's going to be a case study. Case study meaning one individual and their behaviors. If you're interested in this study that I was just talking about, they go into, from what I remember, what they believed caused and initiated his sexual desires with horses and whatnot, and also went about explaining the treatment of this guy as well. So that's case study. One individual being studied very closely. Could be some really unusual or uncommon type behaviors and things. So it'd be more suited to a case study. Surveys are really good. We've talked a little bit about that. You can ask these really private questions like, have you ever cheated on your spouse or partner? About so many things about sexuality are still very taboo. You don't really know how openly you can discuss those sort of things. So surveys really cut to, you're by yourself on your computer filling out the survey, and they're not taking any data down on who you are, so it's not going to leak out if there's anything you don't want other people to know about. So surveys are really a good way to do that. It's just questions about behavior and attitudes and beliefs and things like that. Direct observation, this is pretty uncommon as you would imagine, but like we talked about Masters and Johnson, they used direct observation for good reason, because there had been no science on the physiological arousal response and orgasm and things like that. So that worked out. And then the experimental method, this is used a little less frequently. So my undergraduate thesis, I wanted to know if one part of it was if what sort of pornography, different types of pornography, if that had any bearing on religious men's shame or guilt about watching the pornography. So I had many men imagine themselves watching a particular type of pornography, and then they assessed, and then they wrote down different things about, and then I assessed their guilt and shame and things like that. And then, so like imagine like the first type of sex was like imagining a woman by herself masturbating, and that call that a particular type of pornography, and then compare that to people, man and woman, having intercourse type of pornography. So I had several men in this camp who were watching just a solo woman, and then this is the other another group that I compared the groups to was a heterosexual couple having sex. So seeing if you can, experimental method was we'll talk about independent and dependent variable, but what I expected was that the type of pornography that people were watching would have an effect on their feelings towards it. So this was an experiment to see if different types of pornography led to different outcomes. So, case studies, advantages, you get an in-depth exploration, usually of a particular person. And oftentimes this clinical type information. You have a little more flexibility in data gathering procedures. You can play it a little fast and loose, saying, I have these recordings from what my patient said, sort of thing. I'm sure there's more rigorous ways that people do case studies, but it's a little less. Most everyone uses surveys and their particular standards for that may not be as pertinent with case studies. Disadvantages to case studies: it's hard to generalize the results. So like the guy I was talking about who had sex with horses, understanding his behavior and whatnot doesn't really help us understand many other people's behavior. It's more about understanding that individual. So it's hard to generalize the results to other people. You can generalize results if you really work hard to get a random sample of people, ask them how often do you masturbate per week or something like that, and you get the data in. It says 20% of people masturbate weekly. You can kind of more assuredly conclude that the larger population, generalizing to the general population, masturbates, whatever I said, like 20% masturbate weekly. You can generalize those, but that's like a survey. So we're talking about case studies. It's hard to generalize results because it's just one person you're getting data on. Often based on retrospective self-report. That's a disadvantage of most research that's done, but especially with case studies, talking to this one person, asking them questions you may or may not know whether they're giving you complete honest answers and things like that. It's the same disadvantage with surveys. You don't know for sure any of their behaviors or what they're reporting for sure is true. And yeah, case studies are not suitable for many research questions, as you would imagine. So let's talk about surveys a little bit more in detail. I think we've talked about it a lot, but it's good to bring home a few other points. So asking participants about sexual experiences, like I said, is great to do that in a private sort of setting. So that's nice. And you can do small samples of people or large samples of people depending on how much money you have, like in grants and things like that. But for surveys, it's not necessarily the anonymous surveys that are online. Excuse me, real quick. So you can use face-to-face interviews as well as those anonymous surveys and whatnot, like questionnaires, surveys that you can do. But like Kinsey, he trained a bunch of people to administer these interviews and whatnot. And so he had people come into their laboratory space and ask them questions and whatnot. So it can be either, but obviously most common is a survey online. So surveys, advantages to that is that they're just, which is really important for a lot of people, scientists, is that they are quick and anonymous. And it's really good for graduate students who are trying to accomplish a lot within a small amount of time, so they really may rely on surveys to acquire their data. Interviews, if one chooses to do that, which a lot of qualitative research is done in interview format, so a lot of interview research in the past 5 to 10 years or so has been on marginalized groups, so LGBT, Q, and people like that, interviewing and just getting raw data about their experience of life in society being a marginalized group member. There's a lot of research on that. So you can find that through qualitative research that's kind of like a survey. You have, standard questions that you ask everyone, but you get, more creative answers because it's not the, checkbox 1, 2, or 3 necessarily. Could be open-ended. Disadvantages of surveys is that people just may not respond to the questions. So if you're in a direct observation, like we'll talk about, there is no non-response. You're observing what's going on right there. But in surveys, a question may make someone pretty nervous or embarrassed or something. They just may skip it. But as a scientist, you may be really interested in that particular question. So that can be a disadvantage there. Inaccurate information. People may just lie about it and you don't know for sure. And demographic bias, a lot of times, a lot of people who respond to these surveys and whatnot, it's debated in the field whether they really generalize to the population, or is it more people who are educated, affluent, and things like that. So a few big surveys that have been out there as far as sexuality goes is the Kinsey Reports, National Health and Social Life Survey, and you can read these other two that are big research endeavors that were done through survey research. Let's talk about surveys and sampling. So like I said, like if we wanted to understand, let's say in America, how often does the average person masturbate? Something like that. So you really want, in order to answer that question, the easiest way would be to literally ask every single American that there is this question and force them to answer truthfully. Obviously, there's a lot of problems in that perfect way of assessing the prevalence of masturbation in America, so the best way to get around that is to survey people randomly. So if you randomly assess many different people, then you can say, well, the results from this seems to indicate that probably if we did assess 2 times as many people or even 100 times as many people, the results are going to still stay the same, so you can generalize the information. So sampling is very important as far as that goes. You want a good sample so you can generalize to a population. So like I just said, if you really wanted to know the true prevalence of masturbation in American society, you would have to force everyone to answer. Like I said, you can get around this with randomized sampling, and hopefully the participants are, your average Americans. They may or may not be, depending on how open they are about sexuality. But as far as volunteer bias, or as far as people not having, you can't ethically force people to answer these sort of questions. So there are different problems that scientists run into as far as understanding sexuality. And then a lot of people, when you ask questions like how often do you have sex, and then you could say 1 to 2 times a week or 3 to 5, something like that, what they choose, it really depends on what do they believe sex is. I've had students in the past who have argued that sex is only when is only between 2 partners and when they both have orgasms at the same time. I had a student who argued this. And so for them, that would be sex. But then a lot of other people may consider just heavy petting and things to be sex. So you don't really know as a scientist unless you're very explicit. That's why a lot of scientists use language like engage in penile vaginal intercourse or oral anal intercourse, like very, very specific behaviors to get around this problem of defining terms. For example, college students, 40% of college students, only 40% of college students count oral sex as having sex, and 20% do not believe that anal sex is having sex. So if you just generally ask people how often you have sex, you may not be able to get much intelligible information from that. So thought-provoking question. Remember, thought-provoking questions are just to try to get you thinking on your feet a little bit more. This is where, and if we were in person in class, I would get you guys to talk to each other and whatnot. So just kind of pause a little bit and think about this. But think back to when we were talking about like my master's thesis here at Bowling Green. If the best way to understand tantric sex would be to find people who actually practice tantric sex and whatnot. So what might be disadvantageous about studying only tantric practitioners who are willing to be evaluated? We talked about the very important point that most, if not all, people who practice true tantric religious sex, most of the teachings are secret. So if you're studying tantric practitioners who are willing to talk about their practices and beliefs and whatnot, you may want to hesitate to be able to generalize to all tantric practitioners. You may just get this subset that kind of maybe want to be tantric practitioners but aren't actually officially that. More problems with surveys and sampling, especially with sexuality, is that, and we've touched on this briefly before, that people may intentionally misrepresent themselves. So studies have shown that men tend to inflate the number of partners that they have. So if you're studying just men and the prevalence of their sexual behaviors is probably a little inflated. So their true number of partners is probably a little bit lower. Alternatively, with women, oftentimes they underreport the number of partners that they have. You can see how, in our society over time, as we have seen, for men to have sex, that's good, but then women especially had more of the restrictions throughout time on them. So as far as just talking to another person about number of sexual partners, it may be less embarrassing for women to report a fewer number of partners. So that's a problem with surveys, is that they may not tell the truth, and we've talked about that. Social desirability, wanting to appear better than what their behaviors are. Also, another point to think about is that a lot of participants may really kind of catch on to what the psychologist is trying to get at in the study, and they may try to, just appease the person, be like, oh, you're giving me some money for me to be a participant, so I'll just try to give you what you want, sort of thing. And that would be considered demand characteristics as far as a flaw or challenge in survey research. Another problem with surveys is that some of these topics is difficult to recall the answers. So if you want to understand child abuse and you're asking an adult what happened back when they were 4, 5, and 6, it's going to be very challenging to really get good data on what happened and how it affected them, because their age, and then often trauma will interfere with memory, so inaccuracy of recall it can be a problem with survey research. And then poor at assessing process or why questions. So if you have someone who suffers from a lot of pain in their genitals while they're having sex, you can't just survey and be like, even in an interview, and be like, why is that? A lot of people don't necessarily know. All right, in direct observation, so we have, Masters and Johnson, who are our pioneers as far as direct observation go, getting people to come in. There's no surveys. You don't ask people, were you aroused? You could do supplemental research like that, but you're not going to ask, let's see, a man, are you aroused right now? They will go over some physiological devices that people can use in conjunction with direct observation, but you can see for yourself an erection right there, and you can consider that arousal. I know it's important to know not just every erection necessarily means a person's aroused, but the focus as far as direct observation goes on is like, well, we're going to take that ambiguity of the surveys out of the research. Like, last time you had sex with your partner, were you really into it or not? And as far as direct observation goes, you can kind of, tell whether the person was really sexually interested in their encounter. So eliminates the possibility of falsification. Someone may be embarrassed about, like if we had some sort of experiment with let's say like a particular subset of people who may be aroused by child pornography. If you ask them in surveys and whatnot, they may say, no, I'm not aroused by this or that. But then directly observing, I have read some studies that have done this, directly observing people, and you can get a more accurate sense of arousal as far as that goes. A big disadvantage, obviously, by this is that they know that they're being observed, and 99.9% of the time people tend to be sexual in private, so it kind of influences the results, and like hard to really generalize necessarily to people outside of the participants who are engaging in the study. So watch this video on Masters and Johnson's research. It's very interesting, and keep an eye on, what did they do different experimentally that's so different from people before, direct observation, and how did this contribute to the science of sexology. Alright, the experimental method. It's in a controlled laboratory. Different ways that you can measure arousal, like a penile strain gauge. I'll show you a picture of that later, but basically it's this gauge that you put around the penis, and then as far as assessing arousal, it opens and assesses how big the penis gets. And so that can be a telltale sign of arousal. So this can be done in an experimental way. So difference between independent variable and dependent variable. So if our dependent variable's arousal, the result, we want to know what caused the arousal. So you could see for a particular person, give them many pictures of let's say women naked, or give them a lot of pictures of men naked, and then so the independent variable would be the gender of the pictures, and you can see if that has a result on the behavior. Is there any difference between the naked men that the participant saw or the naked women that the participant saw? Was there a difference between those two in the resulting behavior of arousal? Another example would be like arousal for people who took Viagra, a medicine that's used for people men who have difficulty being aroused and achieving erections and whatnot. The dependent variable is arousal. Independent variable is this introduction of medication, Viagra, into the situation. And the biggest advantage to experimental research is that you can actually get closer to saying what caused X, Y, or Z. All the other research, especially like surveys and whatnot, is pretty hard to determine any sort of causal relationships. It's much more about correlational type things. So as far as experimental research, we'll keep with the example of Viagra. You have a group of men, so you take a randomly assigned group of men who have erectile dysfunction, right here. Check out where my cursor is. And then you randomly assign those men into the intervention group who gets Viagra, and then the control group who gets, this says old drug, but for our example here, it would just be no drug, but they think that they're getting a drug, so a placebo, like a sugar pill. And then you see, is there a difference between the groups? Did the group that received Viagra, are they getting erections now compared to the control group who did not receive Viagra but instead received a placebo? So this would be experimental research. You have a variable, the Viagra, throw it in there into the equation and see if it alters the dependent variable, which in this case is arousal. So I should have had this picture a little sooner. It would have made a little bit more sense on things. So electronic devices for measuring arousal, instead of like surveys, just asking people about their arousal, level of arousal, and things like that. You can put them in different scenarios, different pictures, things like that. And for one example, the penile strain gauge, like I demonstrated, the bigger the penis gets, you can interpret that as more arousal. There's also a vaginal photoplethysmograph that measures blood and lubrication, so you can assess arousal that way. Also the same, there's a clitoral photoplethysmograph that does the same thing. And then vaginal and rectal myograph that measures muscle tension within the body during arousal as well. And so all these things can be used for your research. So thought-provoking question here. What are the advantages to measuring sexual arousal by like the penile strain gauge or the other ways? And pause and reflect on this, think about it. Like I said, this is where I'd have you talking with your partners in the class about what you think, but as far as what I think is that maybe people may be embarrassed about what they are actually aroused by. So having these sort of measures says, well, it seems like you were aroused even though you're reporting that you weren't. Things like that. Another question to think about, is arousal even an important construct to measure in sexuality? Is it the end-all be-all? Is that really the main dependent variable that we're interested in this class? Is it all about arousal and or arguably maybe satisfaction of orgasm? Is that all of the psychology of sexuality? Or is there more to psychology of sexuality than just arousal? And if so, what are some of the other dependent variables that are so interesting for us? One being maybe relationship satisfaction with your lover and things like that. So think of other dependent variables, outcome measures that would be interesting for people. So it's good to go over the ethical guidelines again for any of this psychological research, especially with sexuality, since it's such a private type of questions and whatnot. So like for me right now, I'm studying the empirical literature that has to do with adolescence and compulsive sexual behavior. Now for my actual dissertation, when I do a study, I very well may have to move it to 18 and 19-year-olds in order to get around. You can't just like there's a lot, as you would imagine, a lot of hoops you have to jump through in order to study sexuality within children or adolescents and things like that. So that's one consideration. But general considerations is that you can't pressure, of course, anyone into participating, as you all well know, especially if you've taken Psych 101 and whatnot. informed consent. You have to tell them what they need to know coming into it, if there's any risk, and things like that. Confidentiality is always very important for research in sexuality, and even anonymity. And then, you always have to question whether, if you use deception in your research, if you deceive the participants in some way, if it's necessary to do that and whatnot. But they would be informed in the debriefing what they were deceived about. And you always have to pass everything through the Institutional Review Board to say whether your study is ethical or not. Alright, so this is one of the last things that we'll go over today, is sexual health. So whereas our society for so long was more so worried about sexual immorality, more so once the scientists came on the scene, we're a little more interested in just like what is sexually healthy in general. So of course you have the physical and physiological sexual functioning, arousal, lubrication, vasocongestion, which is the blood engorging into genitals. Are all those things healthy? But we'll be focusing in this class on the rest of them. So the quality of your romantic relationships, like with your lover, how your sex life is going, and how things in your relationship may bear into that. Sexual identity and expression is very important. It's arguably good to understand and think about, how do you identify as far as your orientation, and how do you identify as far as your gender, and things like that, and what bearing that may have for the individual in how they navigate in society, especially if it is a less common way of someone to express themselves. Sensuality, intimacy, and pleasure, that kind of goes with relationships a little bit. And obviously our family and religion and community and whatnot has had a lot of bearing on our own individual sexualities, so that's important. And then a little bit broader, so media, cultural norms, and things like that, being in America versus being in the Congo or things like that. How does that have bearing on our individual sexuality? And sexual efficacy, how we feel like about our identity, our gender identity, sexual orientation. Do we feel good about ourselves, and advocating for ourselves if we feel like we're being discriminated against in any way.